yet another devlog. This is week 65. One more week in the bag. This week I was focusing on working on the dialogue system. And so I started working on Monday to get the main UI box working. So if you look over here, um, start this up here. Start the this. I was working with this dialogue manager, and this is the main. This is the main system that dialogue manager provides, and it gives you a whole bunch of functionality. I started last week really diving into the package and really kind of digesting a lot of information. But this week I started implementing the custom UI. So on Monday I worked basically on this first box here, and I was able to get rid of the default UI and replace it with UI elements from my main menu package, which includes the border and just a kind of a alpha background, and then use that font from that package just to keep everything standard, and pretty much the same color scheme for the text. So I was able to get this UI, and that wasn't too big of a job. I've done UI work before, and since this is a kind of a statically defined size, I was able to implement this without too much trouble. And I did a lot of tests to make sure that whatever text you put into it, it behaves properly. It bounds within the box. It has a certain number of lines, so it's full-fledged. And just working with like this dialogue to kind of input text just to test out the UI to make sure it can handle pretty much all situations I throw at it. So I was spending a lot of time and getting more time hands-on with creating UI and Uni. I've done things before, like with a weapon wheel, and then working a little bit with the main menu manager. But this is the first time that I've actually had to really, understand and create UI from custom UI from scratch with other elements. And the other thing that I accomplished on Monday was this little box here. This is like Bark. So it's like a world space UI that kind of an NPC can kind of say things at random and display it, and then it goes away. So that was kind of the hard part on Monday. I was having trouble with the Bark dialogue UI, because if you see that this is a different case. It's not like the dialogue box where it's statically defined. The actual Bark dialogue has to be controlled by its inner contents. It has to like dynamically resize itself, and that was the tricky part for me. I tried using their example because it seemed to be working, but I had to replace it with my own UI. But the problem was I didn't understand all the concepts of how they had it set up. Like, I was vaguely familiar with concepts of like layout group and text, all these like what a layout element is for text, things like there's different components that actually, it's like, how does this UI system, um, when you're doing layout like a static, like the text box, it's kind of self-apparent, but when you're trying to do something else like dynamically resizing, it's not so straightforward. And I had to kind of do a lot of testing and understanding about, how layouts group with these different options in order to get it to work. And I was really kind of struggling to actually get it to dynamically resize itself in a proper way. But I did understand how through testing, how better understand how like content size fitter, these options, how it actually works through a lot of testing, how it actually behaves. And even though I couldn't build it from scratch, I went back to their actual example, and they had it correctly. It was a mix of different layers, like one horizontal, one one vertical layout group, and a content size fitter, that you could actually finally get the solution where you can define a max size and also allow it to, depending on the text size, allow it to scale all the way down to a minimum size. So constraining the UI field by a maximum and a minimum. So that took some doing to figure out. But now I understand, I have a good example how to actually accomplish something like that with Unity UI. It's a different system than what I'm used to working with mobile UI, but that was Monday, and I moved on to trying to figure out, okay, the next step for this is getting portraits in here, right? I just needed one portrait, so I kind of moved on to figuring out how to work with the recording package, how to actually use this, all the settings, and you can do movie, but my goal was to have a portrait that was kind of a transparent background. In order to do that, you need to do a image sequence, and I figured out how to do that. I set up my own camera, set up a spotlight specifically for taking a perspective series of image portraits, and you can see here. Um, so what I had to do is I had to, if you want an animated, you have to go in and look at the clip and match the actual clip's time exactly, so that it'll capture every single frame in the animation. That way you can loop it without having any sort of cuts or skips or anything like that. So the nice thing is that you can start the recording at any point during the animation, and since it's a complete loop, it doesn't really matter. One of the mistakes I made when setting up my camera, I I put in a portrait camera. Um, let's see here. I put in a portrait camera to record, and I had it at a seriously high resolution. I think it was, yeah, 21 by 60. And I took all my images at a very high resolution. So each one of these UI portrait image sequence sets was like, 3 gigabytes, and that's not going to work. If you have, my plan was to eventually have some sort of different sort of like animation. So let's just say a dialogue state changes. You can actually change the portrait to like a different animation. And if I had a whole bunch of these animated portraits at 2 gigabytes, that's not going to work. So what I did is I set up a new camera, a low-res camera, and I recorded a new set off of that. And this actually looks just as good, because even though it's high res, it squeezes it down into small. So all that the resolution is lost anyways. Like, it looks just the same as a low res than a high res. So, and that shrunk it down to like 100 megabytes or something for the animation sequence. And problem solved there. But one of the problems I was noticing, it was kind of hard to tell on this dark background but when I moved away to more lighter, I could see that the actual images were not being generated with this transparent background. It was like actually all black for some reason. And I couldn't figure out how the heck to actually get the recorder to generate the proper PNG images with a transparent background. And it was, this is one of those times where AI, it doesn't give the exact answer. It dances around the issue, and you kind of have it gives you the general area of the solution, but you know, it's not gonna hand you the answer like 80% of the time it gets you really close to the answer and you can figure it out, but this time it's like it just doesn't really know. um, so doing a lot of searching and research, I found this obscure Japanese video, not in English, but they had a screen share where it's like it had to do with if you go into the actual URP render pipeline, you have to do two things. You have to say um, HDR off, and you have to say alpha processing and post processing, and then it worked. And those two things. So yeah, so finally figured out how to do that, and then that kind of solved my problem getting these image generation. From there, it was just a matter of generating new ones and popping it in. So basically, I just had to, let's see, you have to pop it into the source image, the first one, and then you have to give it an animator and tell it to play. The trick is to actually, by default, it'll play the one you set it, no problem, in the animator automatically. But the trick is, if you're switching around, that comes in later. How do you switch between animations? Um, so that was Tuesday. On Wednesday, I tackled the functionality of animation switching. So I made two different animations for the player just to test out, and I set up a new kind of test, uh, a new test dialog box or test conversation that would kind of facilitate what I wanted to accomplish in different scenarios. So functionality like the first functionality, I wanted to be able to say to the system to be like, hey, start this conversation, but there's certain, I had kind of had to dive into the system and kind of figure out how now I had to get under the hood, and this was kind of the beginning of like I've done with Invector and all these other packages where it provides a default functionality that's not quite tailored to what I want, how I want to use the system. So I kind of have to understand the system in order to kind of subclass and modify the behavior to how I want to use the system. So first, I kind of have to understand how the system reacts under the hood and how to work with it. So over the course of Wednesday and Thursday, I was diving deep into the code and kind of beginning to subclass some of these mono behaviors in order to add additional functionality in order for the package to work the way I intended it to work. So one of the functionalities that I had to kind of customize was the ability to tell the system at the very beginning in the initialization that I want to start on a particular portrait, right? And this has to do with indexing. So, this is the main mechanism that you can actually specify within the logic flow of the conversation. So getting familiar with the system under the hood, like how conversations and all, how this whole thing works, but pretty much adding this little parameter here saying, okay, for this conversation, start the player portrait on index 2, and that will pretty much initialize the actual players um, from 1 to 2, and so got that working, and then also the next bit of functionality was actually saying to the system, okay, at this state in the conversation, I want you to change the portrait through a little markup tag. I want you to change the portrait back to the first one, index 1. And the default behavior was that it would do so, um, but the problem is it wasn't a override. It was only for an override for a single character state. So that means on the next one, it would the default behavior would say that, oh, you didn't specify a markup tag. Well, I'm going back to the whatever the default portrait was, and I didn't want that behavior. I wanted it to say, during the conversation, if you override and say change the portrait to this, I want you to stay on that portrait until I tell you to change, right? So that's kind of the functionality I had to implement into the system in order to get it where I wanted it. So it'll stay on the portrait that you last changed it to throughout the conversation. And you know, that'll be good to actually build on from here on out. So initialization portrait and being able to change the portrait and having it stay to what you change it at. So what we have, when we had all that in place and finally working correctly the way I wanted it to, I started taking the next steps of, now that I could switch between portraits, I needed to actually hook it into and provide logic to actually set up. And since I have a lot of experience with the animator now, it wasn't too much of an issue. There was a few bumps, but I was able to sort it out real quickly. It actually hook in logic and actually set the proper, based off the portrait integer that we're looking at. Just pretty much relate that to the animator and say, oh, we're on portrait whatever, or index whatever, and it'll actually kick off and fire the right animation. So now we have these animations that will, even if you change the portrait, it'll play the right animation. So, and then I had the NPC animation, just a single one for now, just so we could have our NPC as a portrait. It'll come a time, I think, for later we'll have an functionality for an NPC to talk to an NPC, but right now this is like the base foundation. So pretty much the final touches of the system is all looking good with the Bark AI and then this. So one of the things I wanted to do was, so I can do sound now per state change if it's defined. Again, through these description fields, through each, I can actually say, if we go up here, I can actually just specify through my audio manager the category and clip again, and it'll play the audio sound. But one of the functionalities is this actual zoom in, right? So, and I was able to take functionality from my player death camera, pretty much a new V camera that's not constrained by any confiner. When you initialize a conversation, it'll switch. I tried to do it another way, using the actual VCam of the actual sector, but that didn't work right off the bat. So I just did my what I've done before with my my death cam, Just set the parameters in a new V camera and then activate that, and it'll go right to where it was. So final touches like actual getting like when you initialize a conversation, the actors will rotate towards each other and face each other instead of just whatever. Um, Also, functionality to during dialogue to actually disable user input interaction, so you can't move or anything, making sure that when the conversation ends, that actual interaction, being able to move, is restored. So yeah, after all that, we had a really good, solid foundation for dialogue. It can be built upon, changed, modified, added onto, but the majority of the work here is completed for the dialogue system, and that gives us a vehicle to actually implement some narrative storytelling and dialogue in our video game. Um, so after all that was done, that was pretty much the epic leg of the dialogue system for now. I'm pretty happy with it. I pushed that to main, and before I had a branching path to decide on. It was either start work on the level, uh, bringing the level to production finish, level 1, or work on the dialogue system. But now the dialogue system's done. Now it's off to working on the level 1 production uh, things. So there's a whole list of things for the level, like adding cover to each area in the level, and adding enemies, and just a whole laundry list of things to actually bring the level up to production finish. And that's what I'm starting to work on now. So I switched over to doing that, and on Friday I really started to go through each of these sectors um, and add cover to every applicable area. So I'm probably halfway done through Friday. It's back to this rote work, but I think one more day I'll get the cover done, and then it's on to adding enemies per each area, per each room. So that's what we'll be doing next week, and this is going to be a bit of work. Adding functionality like cameras can spot you, a lot of different things, but pretty much the objective is to bring this very first level into the standard of a final polished game level. Pretty much coming to the finalization of this first level where all the lighting and the shadows and all the meshes are baked, and it's like solidifying the final result of the first level before I move on to other things. And that's probably going to take several weeks to accomplish, but it'll give me a starting point for the actual final gameplay testing of the level. But that's all to be said. More work to be done next week. For now, we will call it a day, sign off, and thanks for joining us. We will check back in with you next time. Thanks. Bye.